Hello everyone. Alright, so at this point we have a pretty fair visual novel system rolling so far, but now let's add a couple more features to it. So as we are reading this visual novel, we're just going through and we are manually clicking through. So anytime we want to press through, we're just clicking our keyboard away. Well, there's usually an option in visual novels where the system will do that automatically for you and make it proceed at a comfortable pace that you are good reading with. So we're going to make an auto reader feature. And this is going to be tied to our dialogue system that whenever we enable it, it'll automatically go through the lines without any user prompts, and it'll just figure out about how long it should wait on each line based off of the length of that line and the average reading speed that we configure within the auto reader, as well as the speed that we can configure from the settings panel to change that. So we're going to do two things. We're going to make it where we can run the auto, where it just reads through it automatically, and also where we can skip, where it just rapidly proceeds through all of the lines until we get to a place that we want to be at. So let's go ahead and get started. To do this, we're going to make a new script inside of our core dialogue, and let's right click, create a new script, and this is going to be called the auto reader. This is going to be an optional class that you can tack on to the dialogue system, and whenever it is enabled, it'll just automatically take control for the user. But whenever the user decides to click, they'll regain control and they can proceed automatically. Alright, so let's open up that script. We can remove start and update and put this in the dialogue, just the dialogue class. And we need to make sure that we're using TM Pro here because we will be referencing the TextMesh Pro asset along with the text architect. So using TM Pro. That'll get it done right there. So this auto reader, we need to think about what it needs to do. It needs to reference whatever is handling all of the lines that are running. And we know that's our conversation manager. That handles the entire conversation that's been loaded from file. And it knows what line it's on, it knows how far it is, it knows if there's any more. So the auto reader, if it has a link to the config or the conversation manager, it knows if there's currently a conversation and if it can keep rolling. And it also needs a reference to the text architect, which is building the text. So that way, as we are waiting for the text to complete, we can just wait to see if the architect is done building, and then wait for however long we should be reading this line. And also for skipping, we can go ahead and assign the text on that architect directly to its target. So we need references there. Let's make these private and have our first as the conversation manager. And then we also need the text architect. So private text architect. And then we'll also have some variables that we can configure here. These will be public, so let's go ahead and make a public bool for skip, which we will have we'll just make it, we'll make it invisible from the inspector. We can do that with a get set here and set that equal to false, as well as a public float for the speed at which we can multiply the reading speed. And that can be configured through the settings menu. And by default, we'll make that just 1, so 100%. Now, let's also open up our dialogue system script, because this is going to need to initialize the auto reader, if it has one, to know the conversation manager that has been created within the dialogue system. So if we go ahead and come down in the variables, we can see that we have a link to, where is our conversation manager? Right here. We've got a link to our conversation manager and the text architect. Let's also make a private link to the auto reader, just in case we're using one. And inside of initialize, after we get our conversation manager, then let's go ahead and get the auto reader as well. We'll do that at the very end here. We're going to go ahead and try to find it. This is something that can be optional, so we won't force it. We'll go ahead and say if try get component, and we'll just cast out to our auto reader. If that is successful, then we need to make sure that our auto reader is initialized with the conversation manager, so we need a little initialization function. We'll make a public void called initialize, and we'll just take in a conversation manager here. And what we're going to do in here is just say this dot conversation manager equals conversation manager. So for our dialog system, if we have that auto reader, then we'll say auto reader dot initialize, and we'll pass in our conversation manager. And now it will have a link to that. Now about getting our text architect. We don't have public access to that. Let's jump into our conversation manager real quick. And we're going to make our text architect public. And we're not going to make it privately assignable because there will also be an instance later on where we're going to add the opportunity to swap out architects for positioning different ones on different parts of the scene, such as putting an architect in the center of the screen and controlling where you want text to be generated from. So we'll have this publicly accessible and assignable now. So for our auto reader, we can just say that our architect is going to be equal to the conversation manager dot architect. And so our auto reader is going to be turned on by the buttons on the UI. So we can enable it and we can disable it at will. So let's go ahead and make two functions for enable and disable. And what enable and disable are going to do is they're going to start a coroutine that's going to monitor the progress of the conversation manager and take control for the user. So we'll want a reference to this, and we'll just make ourselves the typical variables. We'll have a private coroutine for co running equals null, and then a public boolean for is on, which will be true if co running is not equal to null. So if we try to enable it, and we are already on and running, then let's go ahead and return and do nothing. And if we're disabled and we're not on, then let's go ahead and return because we don't need to do anything there either. Otherwise, we need to start a coroutine. So let's make ourselves a private I enumerator that can run and handle all of this logic. And we will call this auto read. No parameters, nothing else is needed. But in enable, if we go ahead and start this, then let's say co running equals start coroutine auto read. And we'll go ahead and launch this. And on disable, let's go ahead and make sure that we stop coroutine, and we'll stop whatever is running. And so auto read is going to handle the logic for whether we're skipping or we're progressing with the auto detected reading speed. So skip will basically be a boolean that's used inside of auto read to determine how we proceed. If skip is true, then we're going to proceed very fast and just rapidly move through it all. But if skip is false, then we're going to proceed one line at a time and yield and simulate reading speed. So that will be turned true if we click skip, and if we click auto, skip will be false. So on disable, let's just go ahead and make sure that by default, skip is going to equal false as it gets reset every time. So now we can go ahead and start working in auto read. And before we do anything, we need to make sure that it's actually viable to run this thing right now. It does us no good to try to auto read if our conversation is not running. So let's do a quick check if not conversation manager. Do we have a is running? Yes, we do. So if our conversation manager is not running, then we need to yield, break, and do nothing. Actually, what we need to do is we will go ahead and disable, and then yield, break, and not do anything else. Okay. And so basically what auto read is going to do is it's going to handle the waiting, and once it gets to the point where it wants to proceed to the next line, it's going to call the dialog system to proceed to the next line with that the user prompt, the prompt to go next. Now, if we are clicking this for the first time and our dialog has already finished, we should go ahead and clear that dialog and immediately proceed to the next line. But if the architect is still building while we click it, then we'll just go ahead and wait for it to finish and then yield for the duration. So that way, it's going to assume that if we start it when dialog has finished, that we're already ready to move to the next line, and it'll go ahead and prompt us for the next one. So let's go ahead and say if not architect.isBuilding, if the architect's not building while we've started, and our architect.currentText is not equal to string.empty, then we'll say dialog system.instance.on user prompt next. So we will immediately proceed to the next line. And now we can go ahead and start our loop. So while our conversation is still running, while our conversation manager is running, then we can do stuff. So I told you that skip was going to determine how we run this. So let's say if not skip, then we're going to read and wait. Otherwise, we're going to skip. So let's start simple and just do skip. So if we are skipping, then we need to make sure that our architect automatically force completes so that the entire line becomes visible, and we just wait for a small moment of time before proceeding on to the next line. So we can reference our architect and say force complete to force the text to finish generating, then yield return a new, wait for seconds, and just wait for a very small amount of time, maybe 0.05. We can do that. And then once that's done, we have finished, and we can say dialog system.instance.on user prompt next and move to the next line. And of course, outside of the main loop, if the conversation is no longer running, then let's make sure that we go ahead and disable. Now, if we are not skipping, that means we need to wait for the architect to finish building and then proceed to the next line. So let's go ahead and just check. While our architect, while not architect.isBuilding, we need to first wait for it to start building. If it's not building yet, we need to wait for it, and then we need to wait for it to complete. Otherwise, there's a good chance we could skip ahead and just not even wait at all. So if our architect is not building, then we will yield, return null, and wait for it to start. And now we'll get into calculation to figure out how long it should take us to read this line. So as the line is generated, the player's already reading it. So we're already going to have some time elapse by the time it finishes, and we need to keep track of how much time that is. That way we can subtract that from the total time to wait, and it'll be more reasonable and more in tune with them reading as the line is generated and after it's finished. So let's mark the time started as time.time. And now we just need to wait for our architect to finish building. So while architect.isBuilding, then we need to yield return null. So we just wait for it to complete, and now let's calculate the remainder of the time. In order to do that, we need to figure out some default values, some things that will define the basic time for this system, such as what's the default words or characters read per second. That will determine how we can divide our time and find out how much time we need to wait. So let's go right up to the top and let's make some things that we can do. The first thing we want to know is what is the average characters that are read per second? And by characters, these would be letters. It's normally words per second, but you can have some words that are much longer than others. So then you would be having issues with your time. So we're going to go with characters instead. So we'll make a private constant integer called the default characters read per second. And we will go with 18, which is a fair number for someone who reads at a good casual pace, but not super slow. So let's also define some type of read time padding that we'll just tack on to the end of whatever time we decide to wait for. So they'll always have a little bit of extra time in there, just so it's not too quick on certain lines. So we'll make a private constant float, and this will be the read time padding, and we'll set that equal to half a second. So you'll always have half a second of time there. And then let's go ahead and define a minimum read time and a maximum read time for the system. So the minimum read time, I think we should never take down text any sooner than 1 second after it's displayed. I think that might be a fair number. We might change that later on, but we'll go ahead and say private constant float min read time equals 1. And how about the max read time? What about the longest time we'll leave the text on the screen? We'll set something ridiculous like 99, so it can never go higher than 99. I doubt it'll ever go there, but we'll just set a ceiling. So let's head back to the time calculation, and let's go ahead and figure out how much time we need to wait. We're going to make a new float called time to read, which is going to be the total time to wait here. And we're going to set this to a value that is clamped between our minimum and maximum read time. So we'll say mathf.clamp, and we're going to clamp a certain value, we'll put in parentheses, between our min read time and our max read time. This value is going to be, let's say, we're going to take the character count from our text architect, so however many characters are on the screen, and we're going to divide that by the characters that are averaged to be read per second. So since this is going to be an integer divided by an integer, I think we made it up there. Yes, we did. We need to make this into a float. So we need to cast this to a float type. That way we can have decimals and have it architect.tmpro.textinfo.character count. So we'll take the character count, and then we're going to divide that by the default characters read per second. And then whatever that is, we're going to make sure it is no less than our minimum read time and no greater than our maximum read time. And that's about the estimated time. But let's go a step further, and let's now subtract the time that may have already been spent reading while the text was being generated. So time to read, we will go ahead and say equals, let's make sure that this is clamped as well, equals mathf.clamp, a certain value between our min read time and our max read time. And we'll make this our time to read minus the, let's say, the current time, which is time minus time started, which is the total duration that it took for this text to be generated. So we'll subtract that from our total time to read and wind up with the estimated time left to finish the line that the player already started. Okay, and now all we need to do is just divide this by whatever speed we have set to run this configuration at, as well as add the padding, so that way we have that half-second cushion room at the very end. So time to read will equal time to read divided by our speed plus our read time padding. And now we'll go ahead and yield return new wait 4 seconds, and we will yield for the total time to read. Okay, so that may actually be good. I think we'll go ahead and test this out and see how it looks so far. So we need to add this to our dialog system, and we'll go ahead and add the auto reader here. There we go. So now our dialog system can pick up on it. But we do need to link up the auto and skip buttons to start this thing. So quickly, let's jump back in and add that. So we're just going to make two functions to toggle the enablement of this thing, as well as set it to skip or proceed normally. So we'll start with toggling the auto button by clicking that whether it's on or off. So we'll have a public void called toggle auto. So whenever we click the auto button, this is what's going to be run. We need to evaluate if we are skipping or not, because if we're skipping, then that means we are transitioning from skipping to auto speed, and we don't want to go ahead and disable this. We just want to go ahead and switch from one state to the other. So we're going to say that if skip equals, actually if we are skipping, then we want to make sure that all we do is enable. We're not going to turn this thing off at all. We're just going to make sure that we enable it. Otherwise, if we need to evaluate if it's on so that way we can toggle the feature. So if not is on, then let's go ahead and enable it. Otherwise, let's go ahead and disable it. So let's real quick, if we are going to toggle auto, then skip should be set to false. So skip should equal false, but we also need to keep track of what it was a second ago. So let's cache that.
What? No! God, please, no! No!
Bool, previous state equals skip, right before we assign it to false.
No!
So then we'll just evaluate the previous state and figure out if this is a switch over or if this is a brand new toggle just for the auto state. And we'll do the same thing for skip. Toggle skip. Okay, but this time, if we toggle skip, we want to make sure that skip is set to true. And so if we are not in the previous state, if we were not skipping, that means we are transitioning from auto to skip, or we are just going ahead and starting this for the first time. Otherwise, we evaluate if it's on, and we'll enable it if it's off, and we'll disable it if it's on to go ahead and take care of that toggle. And one thing I think we should add to this is a little text on the screen to show us what state we're in, if we're in any state at all. So let's quickly add a reference to a TextMesh Pro object that can show that to us. We'll go ahead and make a serialized field for a private TextMesh Pro UGUI, and we'll call this the status text. This will tell us what we're currently doing. And so let's define two different strings that can be assigned for whether we are in auto mode or skipping. We'll make a private constant string for status text auto, and that's just going to be auto. And then one more for status test skip, which will show that we are skipping. So how about on initialize, let's go ahead and make sure that our status text.text equals string.empty. That way it's blank and does not appear for us. And we don't have to worry about enable, but when we disable, we do want to, yes, we want to make sure that CO running is set to nothing, so we erase that, and it is now off. And let's also go ahead and say status text.text equals string.empty, and go ahead and remove that if we've disabled it. So then with auto read, let's go to toggle auto, and if we are toggling auto, then status text.text equals the status text auto. Otherwise, if we are skipping, then status text.text equals status text skip. So this way we should be able to keep track with whatever we are doing, and it should show on the screen and we know whether we're in auto read or skipping mode. Which means first things first, let's go ahead and create a text that'll show us that. Let's open up the render groups inside of main and root, inside of main, layers, and dialog. Let's set this on the dialog root container. I'm going to create a new UI TextMesh Pro object and just give it a little blue color. I'm also going to change the font to, let's do main menu and call this the auto read status. And we'll go ahead and position this somewhere. I'm going to scale that down a little bit and just move this to the bottom of the screen. Somewhere right there. And we'll go ahead and just center that in the vertical axis. And I think that'll be fine, so we'll just link that up to our reader, which it's not showing up. Did I make that? Oh no, I've selected the input manager. I need the dialog system, and we'll go ahead and link the auto read status text to that variable, and now we can access that. So then we need to link up these buttons now. So if we come into controls where our buttons are at, in panel, we've got auto and skip. Inside of the button component, we've got an on-click field, and if we just click the plus button, then we can now assign an object to here and call code from it. So we can just drag in our dialog system and choose the auto reader, and then choose to toggle auto. And we can do the same thing for skip. Add a new object for the dialog system, function auto reader, and toggle skip. And I think I also need the button on this component, or on this control panel. I need this to trigger the user prompt next for my dialog system. So let me drag that in there. Go to dialog system and on user prompt next. That's the button that gets clicked when I click the screen. You can see it takes up the whole space, and for some reason I didn't have that assigned already. So now I should be able to click the screen, and since it's behind the buttons, I can click the buttons. But if I click outside, then I can proceed to the next line. Okay, how about we go ahead and test that? So let's launch this. Okay, so right off the bat, we can see that our display text vanished. So that's good, that's working. And now I could click through all of this, or I can go ahead and toggle auto. And now we can see we are in auto mode, and we should have it automatically go through. My hands are off, and it is progressing. Okay, so yeah, maybe, but since we're stuck out here, I prefer to think of it like a nice cold shower. Okay, first of all, cold showers are not nice. I don't care what anyone says. And secondly, I don't shower with my clothes on. Let's just find somewhere quick. Okay, so it seems to be pretty well matched with my reading. That was a long fade. Finally, out of that storm. Now let's just hope they have a room here. Let's find out. Hello? Is anyone here? Stepping out from a room in the far back of the lodge, a tall, gruff man took his place behind the counter. That's a nasty storm out there. Okay, so yeah, that's paced pretty well. And again, I was not clicking anywhere in there. I was just letting auto run. And because of that configuration, that was pretty well. Okay, so for some weird reason, I can't replicate it whenever I'm recording. But if I'm not recording, then it happens like magic. So once we reach this line, where we have the wait and append segmentation logic, the auto read doesn't acknowledge that. And it'll go ahead and just run the delay from this line after we have proceeded to this line, so it'll cut it off halfway through and proceed on to the next one. So we actually need to throw in some logic to the auto reader to know when we are on a segment that is waiting, but not waiting on user input. It's just waiting on time. And we need to not advance when that is happening. We need to let it run naturally and then just try to wait for the rest of the line to finish and then execute the waiting time. The way we'll do that is through our conversation manager. We need to know when we are waiting for that wait and append segment. So we have this IEnumerator for wait for dialog segment signal to be triggered. And so if it's C or A, we're waiting for user input, and that all works fine. But whenever we use the wait start signal, then this is going ahead and yielding for a few seconds. But that's also while the auto reader is waiting. So they'll kind of conflict with each other there. So let's quickly make a little boolean. Public boolean is waiting on segment timer. Or rather, maybe I'll call that is waiting on auto timer. And we'll have that publicly retrievable, privately signable. and that'll be false right off the bat. But when we come down here, we will just go ahead and say is waiting on auto timer is true, and then we finish the signal delay, and is waiting on auto timer equals false. So we'll toggle it. So our auto reader will be able to look at this variable and know if our conversation manager is waiting and it's going to go ahead and resume on its own. So let's go back to the auto reader, to the auto read function, and let's go ahead and change one small thing. So while the architect is not building and our conversation manager is not waiting on that auto timer, then we'll go ahead and yield in return. Again, this line is if there's no text being generated on the screen, we need to give it a second and wait. And while the architect is building or the conversation manager is waiting on auto timer, we're going to yield here. So while the text is being constructed, or if the text has stopped being constructed because it's hit that wait segment, then if the conversation manager is waiting and it's going to continue itself, we don't do anything. We wait for that to finish. And then once it's done with that whole line, with the waiting and everything, then we'll go to the time to read and take care of that. And by adding that little text, the issue where it was proceeding prematurely on our wait and append line is no longer happening. So now it's proceeding at a good pace. Another problem is we can still click while this auto reader is still running, and it doesn't actually stop the auto reading. So we want to make sure that we change that. And also, if we click while the auto reader is running, there can be points where we may reach a line and it will just kind of freeze, or it'll proceed too fast, or it'll proceed too slowly because the timer is off, because we've now clicked to a different line that is using the wrong timer. So we need to go ahead and make sure that whenever the system adjusts and calls for the dialog system to progress, that it does so without stopping the auto reader, but whenever the user prompts it, it will go ahead and stop the auto reader. Which just means for our dialog system, we need another variant of onUserPromptNext. And this one is just going to be for the system. So on systemPromptNext. And all that's going to do is call the same logic there, but now we can change onUserPromptNext. So we can check the auto reader and cancel it if it's running, so the user can take over control. So let's go ahead and check if auto reader dot or is not equal to null and auto reader dot is on, then let's say auto reader dot disable. So we'll let the player take control again. Then let's make sure we change an auto read from using onUserPrompt to onSystemPrompt. That way it doesn't try to cancel itself. So on systemPrompt, and it'll just try to progress to the next line. And if we go ahead and launch it and hit auto, and then I hit spacebar, you can see that we don't actually get taken out of auto mode.
Yeah.
And that's because what's happening is it's actually being re-triggered because of the event system. So as soon as I cancel it, by pressing the spacebar and having auto as the last selected button, the event system is re-triggering it. So what we need to do is just come to our event system, and you'll notice that since we switched to the new input system, we should now have an error saying we're using a standalone module. So let's just replace with the input system. There we are. And now let's give that another whirl and try this out. Go ahead and change it to auto, and then space, and we have exited auto mode. And if we skip and space, yep, it'll go ahead and stop. So we can skip throughout everything. But you notice with skip, we do have some odd issues. For one thing, Stella disappeared. For another, we have an error saying another coroutine is already waiting for this coroutine. So we know that with skip, and this is why I was talking about in previous episodes, why we set up coroutines the way we do to cancel themselves out when they're called and only start themselves in certain conditions, is because we are essentially testing for users clicking rapidly, and making sure that we have fail-proof code that will happen in those scenarios. Well, skip essentially tests that for us in the most rapid case possible. And you can see there are a few issues that we will have to go back and fix, but not much, so that's good. It's just we're skipping, so we are rapidly calling things over and over again, quickly terminating logic, quickly restarting things. And so skipping is a good stress test for your code and making sure that everything is right. So it's not bad to see errors right now with those issues. It's nothing game breaking, but things that we do need to address. And we'll get to that in another video. But for right now, auto and skip are working. Everything looks good. So I'm going to end this episode off here, and then we'll adjust those issues that we saw with skip in the next video. All right, I'll see you guys there. Bye.